Hello there, this is Malcolm Gladwell. Welcome to Radio Headspace. I'll be guest hosting Radio Headspace this week, and I'm so happy to be here. If you don't know, I'm an author, journalist, and podcast host. And over the years, I've written a lot about how to become great at the things you love. So this week, we're going to talk about performance. I'll be sharing some personal experiences that led me to where I am and the lessons I learned along the way about how to reach your goals. But first, we're going to start off today's episode by taking a look at the late Bud Winter, one of the people featured in my new podcast, Legacy of Speed, a show about the athletes of the Speed City track and field program and their legacy of sports activism. Winter was one of the greatest track and field coaches of all time. He broke the mold of traditional training techniques for sprinters by introducing revolutionary relaxation techniques. Today, I'll dive into some of those techniques and show you how they can help improve your fitness routine, work performance, and stress levels. I think if you made a list of the greatest coaches of the 20th century, Bud Winter would be in the top 5. He was a coach at San Jose State who spent the war years working on a project to try and improve fighter pilot performance. What he learned was that an enormous number of fighter pilots in the Second World War were kind of crashing and burning, were having breakdowns because they couldn't handle the stress of flying. And he was part of a group that said that peak performance comes through relaxation, not through obvious effort. Readying ourselves and gritting our teeth and tensing our muscles and all those things that we do naturally, faced with a big challenge, actually undermines our ability to meet that challenge. The people who were assembled by the Air Force during the Second World War to try and fix the problem of these fighter pilots who were having breakdowns were people who had thought deeply about this. There was a number of very well-known kind of practitioners of mindfulness and kind of meditative therapy. Bud Winter was not someone formally trained in this area. He stumbles upon it. At the end of the war, he's like, wait a minute, this would apply perfectly to coaching athletes. There are so many examples of Winter's magic. One of the biggest examples is the work he did with a runner named Lee Evans. And Lee Evans was one of his prized runners and was the favorite for the 400 meters going into the Mexico City Games. And as you may recall, the Mexico City Olympics were engulfed in controversy. And Lee Evans gets swept up in that. And a few hours before the final in the 400 meters, he's at this press conference and people are just screaming at him and he gets overwhelmed. And he turns to Bud Winter and says, I'm not going to run. He's a wreck. And Winter says to him, the condition you're in now, you couldn't run to the corner store for a thing of milk. Winter whisks him away from this crazy scene at the hotel and puts him through what we would recognize now as essentially a meditative routine. But you have to remember, this is 68. This is 50 years ago. This is not what athletes did. But he walked him through this process to the point where Lee Evans finally falls asleep. And when he wakes up, he's sort of refreshed and renewed and goes to the track and not only wins, but sets a world record. The orthodoxy around high performance, particularly in those years, but I think still to some extent today, is that we believe that those who are aiming for peak performance need to push themselves. And when we use that phrase, push themselves, what we mean is to exert themselves, to go into the red, to use maximum effort. If that's your mindset, then you're going in the opposite direction of relaxation and control over your emotions. What Winter understood, and which was the way towards maximum performance, is not to behave as if you are trying to maximize your performance. In other words, the runner who is running their absolute fastest will not look like they are running their fastest. So I realized that I had kind of stumbled onto some of these truths on my own over the years. My dad was a mathematician, a man of great calm and self-possession. And I would try and do math problems as a kid, get very frustrated. And he would come and sit next to me. And the first thing he would do is to tell me to take a deep breath. The second thing he'd do is he would take whatever piece of paper I was working on that was covered in scribbles, and he would throw it out and give me a clean sheet of paper. He would sharpen my pencil. He would tell me to slow down, and then he would very calmly and quietly walk me through the problem as if it was the easiest thing in the world. Now that's math, that's not physical performance, but it's the same idea that if I was to reach maximum cognitive performance, I needed to be within myself. I couldn't be all over the place and fretting and, panting with exertion about the problem ahead of me. I think I would say to people who have difficulty getting into that place where relaxation and exertion belong together is that they need patience. When I think about running, if I go out and run 8 miles, the first mile is not calm and relaxed and peaceful. It can be a little bit of a struggle. And I can entertain during that first mile all kinds of thoughts about whether I want to be running, or do I have the energy for this, or wouldn't I rather be at home in bed? But then over time, then this kind of wave of peacefulness descends and it all starts to make sense. But it only makes sense if I'm willing to stick with it past that and get over that threshold. Our culture is obsessed with young people achieving high levels of success, and that can be amazing to watch. But it's important to note that success doesn't have to come at an early age. There are lots of benefits to being a late bloomer. In fact, I would argue that in many instances, you're probably better off being a late bloomer than being a prodigy. Just use music for an example. There have been numerous studies of musical prodigies. What we learn is that very, very, very few of them ever go on to be truly accomplished adult musicians. So why is that? Well, because when we observe a prodigy, what we are observing is a child who has managed to mimic the ability and skill of an adult musician. But that is a completely different skill from developing an individualized voice as a performer. An adult is someone who manages to take all of the kind of training and learning and lessons they learned during their adolescence and transform them into something entirely new and different, something qualitatively different. And that is hard to do. There's lots of good examples of late bloomers. The most famous would probably be Cezanne, one of the greatest artists of the last, 500 years. He does his greatest work at the end of his life. And the reason is that the kind of thing he was trying to do in painting was very difficult and had never been done before. And it took him an entire lifetime to master it. If you wanted to paint super realistic portraits in, 1860, you could master that by 25. If you want to invent an entirely new way of representing life in works of art, that could take you your whole life. I don't mean to say in all of this that you can't have genius come from precocious people. That's not what we're saying. We're saying, though, that there's two categories. Picasso is someone who's painting extraordinary stuff in his 20s. Picasso is the anti-Cezanne. They're basically contemporaries, but their careers could not be more different. But they're representing two different ways of achieving greatness. And my worry is that we've fallen so in love with the Picassos or with the, Orson Welles, who does Citizen Kane when he's 22, that we forget about Hitchcock, who's doing his greatest films in his 70s and 60s. I would argue, and I think the evidence bears this out, that late bloomers, by virtue of how long they spend in the wilderness before they reach their calling, need a lot more social support. I remember writing about a novelist named Ben Fountain, who wrote a series of extraordinary books, all past the age of 40 or 45. And he spent 20 years basically trying and failing at writing, which was made possible by the fact that his wife was a lawyer who supported him and the family. There are certain institutions that understand and support the late blooming idea. If you're a medical doctor and you want to become, some kind of specialist surgeon or what have you, they will support you for years and years and years while you learn your craft. And there are lots of institutions like that. Go to the military. There are no 30-year-old generals. They support a kind of talent development pool that backs people for decades before they can tell who's going to be the one that will rise to the top. The other part of it, I think emotional support is as valuable as financial support. The truth is, Ben Fountain could have done what he did. It might have taken a little longer, but he could have had a part-time job. He could have just written on the weekends, as long as he had people in his family who believed in him and told him that the sacrifice he was making was worth it. So I do think discouragement is the greatest enemy of the late bloomer. The advice I would give to someone who feels stuck or that they aren't where they should be is, when it comes to mastering a new domain, your age is not the relevant number. The really relevant number is how long you've been engaged in that particular work. Take a profession like being a great physicist. Physicists tend to do their best work in their 20s, which led many people to think that, physics is a young person's game. But then they discovered, wait a minute. When people switch into physics in mid-career from another field, they also do their best work in their first 10 years. So it's not about how old you are. There is something magical about when you first discover physics that allows you to see insights in a unique way that others can't see. That should encourage lots of people who are stuck to say, I can switch. And that, the experience I'm bringing from even my first fail go-round can be enormously useful in making sense of my second go-round. As you know, this week is all about performance. Today I'm going to talk about a subject that scares a lot of people: breaking the rules. Don't get me wrong, rules are great to keep us safe and have their place, but a lot of innovation can happen when we challenge the status quo. And I'll talk about a friend who helped open my eyes to the beauty of breaking and bending the rules and how that changed my perception of the world. Rules have two functions. One version of rules are what I would call necessary rules. When you see a red light, you stop. And that's a rule that actually allows for the safe and free movement of people throughout the world. There's another set of rules, though, that are simply about the codification of norms, that simply describe how we think people ought to behave. That second category of rules can be highly subjective and can be based on assumptions that don't make sense in a new and modern world. And what innovators very often are people who question that, who say, wait a minute, that thing that we thought of as being the first kind of rule, a kind of necessary rule, isn't a necessary rule. It's just a codification of a norm, and we'd be better off without it. And they have the courage to go ahead and break that rule. One of the first great rule breakers I met in my life was a guy named Terry Martin in my little town, in little high school in southwestern Ontario. We were paired together in science class, and he wouldn't ever do the experiments the way we were supposed to do the experiments. His position would be, we're in a class of 30 kids, 28 of them are all doing the experiment exactly the same way. Why wouldn't I do it a different way so I can learn something else? His point was, there's nothing more to be gained by us doing it the conventional way. The only way we can push the envelope here is to scrap the guidelines we've been given and start over. So the rule breakers who worry me are those who are not committed to the spirit of their enterprise, Vladimir Putin is a rule breaker. He's not an innovator. He is someone who has broken with the spirit in which heads of state are supposed to conduct themselves, right? He bombs civilians. That's breaking the rules, but that's not breaking the rules in the spirit of advancing the cause of mankind or fighting wars in a more just or more. No, that's just radical, transgressive, and deeply criminal behavior. And that's not what Terry Martin was. Terry wanted to learn more in a short period of time and felt that that allowed him to bend the rules a bit. The advice I'd give to someone who's afraid to take an unconventional path or break the rules is that the cost of breaking the rules is often much smaller than we think. One cost is failure. It doesn't work, right? But failure is also an inevitable cost of many attempts we make within the rules. If your chances of failure are quite high if you pursue a conventional course, then you have nothing to lose by breaking the rules. The upside, however, is much higher for the rule breaker. You have a chance to see the world in a different way, to learn something you wouldn't have learned otherwise. There are all of these kinds of benefits, potential benefits, that would have been impossible to realize if you had just done what everyone else was doing. The biggest impediment to breaking the rules is social disapproval. And as human beings, that's really what stops us, because we tend to be very, very aware of what others are thinking about us and very susceptible to that kind of social pressure, social criticism. And what rule breakers have in common is they learn to quiet those, to ignore those contrary voices. So if you look at any kind of successful innovator or entrepreneur, that's one of the core things they all have in common. You don't want to have people who have zero concern for what the rest of the world thinks of them. But it is really useful to be able to say to yourself, you know what? The fact that lots of people I know think I'm crazy for pursuing this path, that's fine. It's not the end of the world, right? My livelihood and happiness does not depend on 100% of my friendship circle supporting, or even the world supporting my choices. Learning how to have a little bit of a thick skin is an enormously useful trait when it comes to this kind of rule breaking. There's no learning without curiosity. That's the main reason why curiosity is so important. Learning is where you are adding to your existing store of knowledge. And you can only add to your existing store of knowledge if you concede to yourself that your existing store of knowledge is inadequate. That requires an act of humility, understanding that even if you consider yourself an expert, your expertise is not complete. I went into journalism when I was quite young, when I was just out of college. I was a newspaper reporter, and being a newspaper reporter is essentially curiosity training. You never know what the news of the day is going to be, and you're very often called to master some situation, some phenomenon, some happening in a very short period of time. You do that by having a kind of radical form of this humility. You have to be willing to call someone up and say, I know nothing about what just happened. Please tell me. And then when you talk to that person, you call up someone else and you say, I just talked to someone who told me this much about what happened today, but my hunch is that's only part of the story. Tell me your version of events, right? You do that every day for 10 years, as I did. You have developed a set of habits around curiosity. You never assume you know everything. It reminds me of beginner's mind. Beginner's mind is a kind of a way of erasing preconceptions. And what are preconceptions? They're barriers to learning and curiosity. We've set up in our mind these little kind of roadblocks that say, I'm not going to go down this road, I'm not going to go down this road, I'm going to go straight. I'm not going to explore all these little side roads and byways. And beginner's mind is you take all of those roadblocks and you remove them and say, you know what, I'm perfectly happy to turn left here when normally I would have turned right. And that's a lovely way of approaching the world. Think how great of an appreciation you would have of your world if every day you took a different route to work. Well, that's what we're talking about, taking a different route to learning. At the heart of curiosity is the willingness to ask questions and the willingness to listen to the answers. If you're just a listener, that helps you a little bit, but it doesn't allow you to direct your curiosity in the direction you want it to go. If you only ask questions, but you're not open to the answers, then you've turned on the water faucet, but you're not drinking from it, right? That doesn't help you either. You need both. Being willing to ask questions, even questions that make you look dumb. By the way, if you ask enough questions, you will eventually look dumb. What you're doing is you're exposing to the person you're talking to the depths of what you don't know. And then that second part, the listening, is where you take what you've learned and you add it to your store of knowledge. You use it to challenge what you already know. You use it to augment what you already know. Maybe you use it just to consider and ultimately to reject. But you have to engage with what you've learned. So those two things are really powerful habits, but they are habits. They are things you need to practice or they will go away. People should understand that advancing their own understanding is a form of deep intellectual and kind of emotional joy. If there's a moment in every day when you can say, I made progress, even if what you mean by progress is, this was true and now I realize it's not quite that way, you're a better person than you were at the beginning of the day, right? You're more fully formed. Thanks so much for having me as your guest host this week. Adversity can be coded as a negative thing we have to overcome, but a lack of obstacles can rob us of the grit we need to build character. So let's talk about how to approach life's challenges in a way that's productive and overcome adversity in a way that benefits us in the long run. What strikes me when I look around at the people who are successful are the ones who have a certain amount of determination and are willing to persevere. You know, in writing, all of the best writers I know are people who do not just a few more drafts, but like twice as many drafts of any given thing they're working on than the people I know who are not successful. Unsuccessful writers, in my mind, tend to be people who just are not willing to persevere at a given piece of writing until it works. They give up too soon. My first drafts aren't terribly good. I sometimes start over. Instead of thinking of that as evidence of my weakness or failure, I just think of that as normal. That's what it takes. And I'm also a big believer in small victories. When you are faced with an overwhelming task, what you need to do is divide it up into many different smaller tasks. And when you win at one of those smaller tasks, to pat yourself on the back. You know, there's a standard running workout that middle distance runners do, which is 10 times 400 meters. So 10 times once around the track. It's pretty daunting when you think about that workout going in. So as opposed to you finish one and you go, oh God, 9 more. They finish one and they say, we finished one. Wow, that was great, right? It's like they divide it up into 10 different activities and you conquer one at a time. And that way, it sounds like a really simple thing, but it's so liberating. Dividing stuff up and making sure that you give yourself credit for each stage along the process is, I think, a tremendously important way of dealing with the fear of failure and with feeling overwhelmed. Because we get overwhelmed when the mountain seems insurmountable. But if you think of the mountain as actually 10 much smaller hills, it's not so insurmountable. Let me give you an example of how a challenge can be productive in a kind of roundabout way. In my book, David and Goliath, I did a whole chapter on why it was that so many entrepreneurs were dyslexic. The reason for that is that you can divide dyslexics into two groups. There are those who are defeated by their disability, and for many good reasons. Like dyslexia in its most severe form really is crippling. You can't read, which severely limits. But there's another group of people for whom that condition is a kind of spur to explore other facets of their personality. So when I interviewed all these successful dyslexic entrepreneurs, they all had the same story, that they were people who in school responded to the fact that they couldn't do schoolwork by learning how to build teams, by learning how to bend the rules, by learning how to sell themselves. They would tell stories about convincing teachers to change their grade from an F to a C, or how they would talk the smartest kid in the class into showing them their homework. And so they're people, by the time they get out of school, they've spent 15 years practicing how to sell themselves, how to build teams, how to break rules. And what's that? That's training for entrepreneurship. So what they had done, in other words, is they had taken something that seemed like an insurmountable challenge, and they just kind of flipped it on its head. They're not doing it necessarily consciously, but they're taking that and they're seizing the kind of opportunity in it, which is, I'm going to practice a whole series of things that quote unquote healthy kids, normal kids, never practice. And that in the end is going to put me ahead of the game. That idea that a challenge is almost always a two-headed coin. And on one side is the challenge, but on the other side is often an opportunity. And understanding where there is an opportunity buried in a challenge is, I think, the trait that so many successful people have. All right, that's it from me. It's been a pleasure to guest host this week. And if you liked today's episode and are drawn to stories about challenges, perseverance, and changing the status quo, then check out my new podcast, Legacy of Speed. It's a show about the athletes of the Speed City Track and Field program and their legacy of sports activism. The link is in the show notes. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for listening, and have a great weekend.